In the summer of 1174, the political landscape of the Near East was a whirlwind of change and uncertainty. The great Sunni leader Nur al-Din, who had for decades been the most formidable opponent of the Crusader states, was dead. His death left a power vacuum that ambitious men rushed to fill. Chief among them was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. He was the vizier of Egypt, a land he had secured in his master's name. But with Nur al-Din gone, Saladin saw his chance. He marched north from Egypt, not to attack the Christians, but to consolidate his own power over his Muslim rivals in Syria, setting his sights on cities like Damascus and Aleppo. This internal struggle for control of the Islamic world consumed his attention, creating a brief, fragile moment of respite for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. While Saladin was busy cementing his authority and fighting Nur al-Din's heirs, a change of leadership was also taking place within the Christian kingdom. King Amalric of Jerusalem died just weeks before Nur al-Din, leaving his throne to his only son. This was no ordinary succession. The new king, Baldwin IV, was just 13 years old. More tragically, he was afflicted with leprosy, a disease that was not only physically debilitating but also carried a heavy social stigma. Many wondered how a boy, let alone a boy with such a grave illness, could possibly hope to rule a kingdom surrounded by enemies. The court appointed a regent, Count Raymond III of Tripoli, to guide the young king, but everyone knew the kingdom's future rested on the frail shoulders of its new monarch. The initial years of Baldwin's reign were defined by this strange parallel of internal consolidation. In the north, Saladin fought a bitter campaign against the Zengids of Aleppo, the former allies who now saw him as a usurper. He spent months laying siege, negotiating, and battling for every inch of territory, striving to unite the Muslim forces of Egypt and Syria under his single, undisputed command. His focus was entirely inward, on building the empire he believed was necessary to one day drive the Franks from the Holy Land. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, for a moment, was not his primary target. He was building his power base, and that meant dealing with family rivals and Syrian warlords before he could turn his full attention to the Christians. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the young Baldwin IV was growing into his role far quicker than anyone expected. Despite his youth and his worsening illness, he displayed a remarkable strength of will and a keen intellect. He learned the arts of governance and warfare, listening to his advisors but forming his own opinions. He understood that the peace offered by Saladin's preoccupation with Syria was temporary. It was a gift of time, a chance to prepare for the inevitable storm. The boy king was not content to simply wait for Saladin to finish his campaigns and turn south. He was determined to show the world and Saladin himself that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not led by a helpless invalid but by a true king. As Saladin continued his campaigns in northern Syria, his envoys eventually made their way to the court of Jerusalem. They came with offers of peace, proposing a truce that would allow both sides to focus on their own affairs. For Saladin, this was a practical move. A treaty with the Franks would secure his southern flank, freeing him to commit all his resources to crushing his rivals in Aleppo and Mosul. To many in the Crusader court, the offer seemed sensible. The kingdom was led by a sick boy, its military resources were limited, and a period of peace would allow them to strengthen their defenses and recover their strength. It was the safe, logical choice, a chance to breathe in a world that was constantly suffocating them with threats. However, Baldwin IV, now coming of age and asserting his authority, saw the situation differently. He listened to the cautious advice of his regent Raymond of Tripoli, who favored accepting the truce. But the young king possessed a spirit that belied his physical condition. He saw Saladin's offer not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a sign of temporary weakness. He believed that accepting peace would be a mistake, a display of fear that would only embolden their enemy once he had finished with his other foes. Baldwin argued that this was the perfect moment to strike, to show Saladin that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not a passive pawn in his grand game, but an active and dangerous opponent in its own right. He chose defiance over diplomacy. This decision was a turning point. It marked Baldwin's transition from a boy king under a regency to a ruler in his own right, one with a clear and aggressive military policy. He rejected Saladin's peace terms outright. This was an incredibly bold, almost reckless move. He was deliberately provoking the most powerful Muslim leader of the age, a man who commanded the vast resources of Egypt. Baldwin was gambling that Saladin was too entangled in his Syrian wars to retaliate effectively. He He wanted to send a clear message. The Franks would not wait to be attacked. They would take the fight to their enemies, choosing the time and place of battle themselves. His decision shocked many, but it also inspired a fierce loyalty among his knights. In refusing the truce, Baldwin was not just making a strategic military decision, he was making a statement about his own reign. And he would not be defined by his illness. He would not be a king who hid behind castle walls praying for peace. He would be a warrior king, in the tradition of his ancestors. He intended to lead from the front to prove that his will was stronger than his disease and that the spirit of the crusade was still very much alive. This act of youthful defiance set the stage for the first direct confrontations between the Leper King and the rising Sultan, a personal and epic struggle that would define the era. Having rejected peace, Baldwin IV knew he had to follow his words with action. He could not simply wait for Saladin to react. He had to seize the initiative. In 1176, with Saladin still mired in his campaign against Aleppo, Baldwin gathered a small but elite force of knights and mounted soldiers. His target was the rich territory surrounding Damascus, one of the most important cities under Saladin's control. This was not a full-scale invasion designed to capture the city, but a strategic raid, a lightning strike intended to disrupt, plunder, and provoke. Leading the army himself, the young king demonstrated his intent to be an active military commander, despite the progression of his leprosy, which was already beginning to affect his hands and feet. The raid was a stunning success. Baldwin's forces swept through the fertile lands of the Ghouta, the green oasis that surrounded Damascus. They pillaged villages, seized livestock, and burned crops, causing chaos and panic just miles from the city gates. The local garrison, loyal to Saladin but not expecting an attack from the south, was caught completely off guard. The Crusader army moved with speed and precision, striking hard before melting away, avoiding any prolonged engagement. The boldness of the attack was its greatest weapon. It showed that the Franks could project their power deep into Muslim territory, threatening the very heart of Saladin's new Syrian domain. It was a direct challenge, a message written in fire and steel. Not content with this single foray, Baldwin pushed his advantage. He led his army further north into the Beqaa Valley, a strategic corridor that connected Damascus with northern Syria. His target was the area around the ancient city of Baalbek. Here his forces engaged and defeated a detachment of the Damascene army that had been sent to intercept them. This victory, though small in scale, was significant. It proved that the Crusader army, even when outnumbered, could best Saladin's soldiers in open combat. For the young king, it was a personal triumph. He had led his men into enemy territory and returned victorious, laden with spoils and prestige. These early military actions had a profound impact. They forced Saladin to divert his attention and resources away from his primary goal of conquering Aleppo. He could no longer ignore the threat posed by the audacious young king in Jerusalem. Baldwin's raids were a constant thorn in his side, a drain on his manpower, and a blow to his reputation as the protector of Islam. The Leper King had successfully demonstrated that he was a force to be reckoned with. He had refused peace and then proven that his kingdom had the teeth to back up its defiance. The chessboard was set and Baldwin had made the first move. The years of 1175 and 1176 were not only marked by military maneuvering but also by the harsh realities of nature. A severe drought gripped the Levant, leading to a widespread famine that affected both Christian and Muslim lands. Crops failed, food became scarce, and the price of grain skyrocketed. This natural disaster added another layer of complexity to the conflict. For Saladin, it strained his resources, making it harder to feed his large armies and maintain long sieges. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was smaller and had less agricultural land, the famine was a grave threat to its survival. The struggle for food became as critical as any battle, influencing the strategies of both leaders. Amidst this hardship, a key figure from the Crusaders' past re-emerged onto the political stage. In 1176, Raynald of Chatillon was released from captivity in Aleppo after 16 long years as a prisoner. Raynald was a man of boundless ambition and ferocious energy, known for his aggressive and often reckless behavior before his capture. His return was a significant event. He was a seasoned warrior with a deep-seated hatred for Saladin and a belief in perpetual, unrelenting warfare against the forces of Islam. He quickly married a wealthy heiress, becoming the Lord of Outnumbered, a vast fiefdom that controlled the vital caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. Raynald's presence immediately injected a new, volatile element into the Crusader court. He was a powerful lord with a private army, and his strategic castles, especially Kerak and Montreal, gave him the ability to strike at the economic lifeline of Saladin's empire. He became a leading voice in the war party, a faction of nobles who, like the king, believed that aggression was the best defense. His personal charisma and fearsome reputation drew many knights to his banner. He was the perfect ally for a young king determined to pursue an offensive strategy, providing the military muscle and ruthless cunning needed to challenge Saladin directly. Saladin was forced to take notice. The combination of Baldwin's bold leadership and Raynald's disruptive presence in Outnumbered was a serious problem. While the famine weakened both sides, the Crusaders seemed to be gaining a political and strategic edge. Raynald's control over the desert roads meant that communication and trade between the two halves of Saladin's empire, Egypt and Syria, were constantly under threat. This forced Saladin to pause his northern campaigns and reconsider his strategy. The Leper King's defiance was no longer just a nuisance, it was shaping into a genuine obstacle to his grand ambitions. Recognizing the immense threat posed by Saladin's growing power, Baldwin IV understood that the Kingdom of Jerusalem simply could not stand alone forever. He needed powerful allies, and so he looked to the most powerful Christian state in the region, the Byzantine Empire. For years, relations between the Latin Crusaders and the Greek Byzantines had been, strained, marked by suspicion and occasional hostility. But the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, was also deeply concerned by Saladin's rise. The unification of Egypt and Syria under a single militant ruler was to him a direct threat to his own influence in the Near East and to the security of his empire's southern borders. In the year 1176, Baldwin sent a high-level embassy to Constantinople to formalize an alliance. The plan they put forward was, honestly, ambitious and audacious. A joint land and sea invasion of Egypt. The logic was sound. Egypt was the source of Saladin's wealth and manpower, the very foundation of his empire. A successful attack could cripple him permanently, relieving the pressure on both Jerusalem and Byzantium. Emperor Manuel, a seasoned and shrewd statesman, agreed to the alliance. He promised to provide a large fleet of warships and to help finance the campaign. This was a landmark agreement, a rare moment of cooperation between the two great branches of Christendom against a common foe. News of the Grand Alliance sent ripples of excitement throughout the Crusader states in Western Europe. The prospect of a major, decisive campaign against the heart of Saladin's power was, intoxicating. It promised not just security, but also glory and riches. The plan depended on coordinating the Byzantine fleet with a large land army from the west. To lead this army, the Crusader lords sent an appeal to Europe, hoping to attract a great noble who could command the forces and provide the leadership needed for such a monumental undertaking. The call was answered by a man of immense wealth and influence, Count Philip of Flanders. Philip's arrival in the Holy Land in August of 1177 was greeted with great celebration and high hopes. He was a cousin of King Baldwin and brought with him a substantial contingent of knights. He was seen as the missing piece of the puzzle, the commander who would lead the combined forces of Jerusalem, Byzantium and the West to a historic victory in Egypt. The stage really did seem set for the most significant Crusader offensive in a generation. With the Byzantine fleet preparing to sail and a powerful European count now on the scene, it felt as though the tide was finally turning against Saladin. The moment of destiny, it seemed, was at hand. The high hopes that accompanied Philip of Flanders' arrival soon began to crumble under the weight of political ambition and personal pride. The leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the ailing Baldwin IV, naturally assumed that the great campaign against Egypt, for which they had worked so hard to secure Byzantine support, would be the primary objective. They offered Philip command of the expedition, a position of immense prestige and power. To their astonishment and dismay, Philip refused. He had his own agenda, one that simply did not align with the strategic priorities of the kingdom he had supposedly come to save. He dreamed instead of carving out his own territory in the north. Philip's refusal to lead the attack on Egypt was a devastating blow. The entire plan, carefully constructed with Emperor Manuel, depended on a strong Frankish land army. Without a commander of Philip's stature and the troops he brought with him, the invasion was impossible. The Byzantine envoys who had arrived to finalize the plans were left waiting in frustration. The Grand Alliance, which had held so much promise, was collapsing before it even began. Philip instead declared his intention to march north and campaign in Syria, perhaps to attack the city of Hama or to assist the Principality of Antioch. His personal ambitions took precedence over the collective security of the Crusader states. This decision created a crisis of leadership. Baldwin IV, though weakened by his leprosy, was outraged by Philip's selfishness. He felt betrayed by his own cousin. The local barons and military orders, like the Templars and Hospitallers, were also angered. They had committed their men and resources to the Egyptian plan, and now found themselves being dragged into a northern adventure that offered little strategic benefit to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The unity that had been so carefully built began to fracture. The Byzantine fleet, having waited in vain for the Franks to commit, eventually had no choice but to sail home, its mission a complete failure. The fiasco of Philip's crusade was a bitter disappointment. It represented a massive squandered opportunity. A decisive blow against Egypt could have changed the course of the wars for the Holy Land. Instead, precious time and resources were wasted. A large portion of the kingdom's army, including many of its best knights, followed Philip north on his fruitless campaign. This left the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Jerusalem dangerously exposed. It was a strategic blunder of the highest order, and it was a mistake that Saladin, ever the opportunist, was watching with keen interest from afar. The Crusaders' disunity had handed him a golden opportunity. Saladin had been observing the events in the Kingdom of Jerusalem with patience and cunning. He was well aware of the Grand Alliance being formed against him and the planned invasion of Egypt. The news of Philip of Flanders' arrival had been a cause for grave concern. However, when his spies reported that Philip had refused to attack Egypt and had instead marched the bulk of the Crusader army north, Saladin knew his moment had come. The internal squabbling of his enemies had presented him with an opening he simply could not ignore. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was now vulnerable in a way it had not been for years, its main army far away and its southern defenses critically weakened. Acting with decisive speed, Saladin mobilized his forces in Egypt. In November of 1177, he crossed the Sinai Peninsula and burst into the southern territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He commanded a massive army, estimated by chroniclers to be over 25,000 strong, a formidable host of cavalry and infantry. His objective was clear: to strike at the heart of the kingdom while its defenders were divided and scattered. He bypassed the formidable desert fortresses and marched directly towards the coastal city of Ascalon, a key strategic prize. His invasion was swift and devastating. His soldiers fanned out across the countryside, plundering and burning the towns of Ramla and Lydda, sowing terror and chaos. The news of Saladin's invasion sent a shockwave of panic through Jerusalem. The situation was desperate. The main Frankish army was hundreds of miles away in the north. The king, Baldwin IV, was only 16 years old and so ravaged by leprosy that he could barely use his hands. He was at Ascalon with a tiny force, a mere handful of knights. The force available to defend the entire kingdom consisted of perhaps 375 knights, some Templars led by their Grand Master Odo of Saint-Amand, and a few thousand infantry. They were hopelessly outnumbered. The logical course of action would have been to take refuge behind the walls of Ascalon and pray for a miracle. But Baldwin IV was no ordinary king. Refusing to be paralyzed by fear or by his own physical limitations, he made a decision of incredible bravery. He would not hide. He dispatched urgent messengers to the Templars and any available forces, ordering them to gather. He decided to confront Saladin's army in the open field. He knew he was facing overwhelming odds, but he also knew that to do nothing meant the certain destruction of his kingdom. He had himself lifted onto his horse, his hands bandaged to allow him to hold the reins, and prepared to lead his minuscule army into battle against one of the largest invading forces the kingdom had ever seen. With Saladin's vast army spreading out across the coastal plain, confident and seemingly invincible, the Sultan made a critical error. He grew overconfident. Believing that the small Frankish force bottled up in Ascalon posed no real threat, he allowed his army to become dispersed as they plundered the rich lands around Ramla. He gave his soldiers permission to raid freely, assuming the campaign was all but over. He did not post adequate scouts or maintain a tight, disciplined formation. He had quite simply underestimated the will of his young opponent. This moment of carelessness would prove to be his undoing, creating the one small window of opportunity the Crusaders needed. From the walls of Ascalon, Baldwin IV and his commanders saw their chance. They realized that Saladin's army was scattered and unprepared for a sudden attack. Despite the terrifying disparity in numbers, they decided to risk everything on a single desperate charge. On the morning of November 25th, 1177, Baldwin's tiny army marched out. The king, unable to wield a sword, rode near the front, a relic of the true cross carried before him as a sacred banner. His presence was an inspiration. The sight of their afflicted king, choosing to face certain death rather than surrender, filled his knights with a fanatical courage. They were not just fighting for their lands, they were fighting for their king and their faith. The Crusaders marched along the coast before turning inland, using the terrain to screen their approach. They caught Saladin's army completely by surprise near a hill known as Montigsard. The Frankish knights, led by the Templars and brave lords like Raynald of Chatillon, formed a tight wedge and charged directly into the heart of Saladin's personal bodyguard. The impact was cataclysmic. The overconfident Ayyubid soldiers, caught in the middle of looting, were thrown into complete chaos. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. What should have been an organized army dissolved into a terrified mob, each man fighting for his own survival. The battle turned into a rout. Saladin himself was nearly captured and only escaped with a handful of his bodyguards, fleeing all the way back to Egypt on a racing camel. His magnificent army was annihilated. Thousands were killed in the battle, and many more perished in the harsh Sinai desert during the desperate retreat, harried by Bedouins. It was a miraculous, almost unbelievable victory. A boy king who could barely sit his horse had led a few hundred knights to crush one of the most powerful armies in the world. The Battle of Montigsard secured the Kingdom of Jerusalem for another decade and cemented the legend of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, as one of the most courageous and inspiring leaders of the Crusades.